The canopy exploded in a shower of plexiglass fragments as Oberleutnant Franz Stigler threw his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a desperate dive. It was March 23, 1944, over the industrial heartland of Western Germany, and something was very wrong. The aircraft pursuing him wasn't behaving like any Spitfire he'd faced over the Channel. The sound alone was different, not the sharp, punctuated bark of cannon fire he'd learned to anticipate and evade, but something closer to an industrial saw ripping through sheet metal, continuous, relentless, inescapable. Tracers streamed past his cockpit in what seemed like an unbroken ribbon of fire, and in that moment, Stigler understood he was facing something the Luftwaffe's training schools had utterly failed to prepare him for. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Stigler survived that encounter, though his aircraft did not. The American fighter that had nearly killed him was a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and its 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns had just shattered every assumption he'd built over 2 years of combat against Royal Air Force fighters. The Spitfire's cannons, while devastating when they connected, fired roughly 600 rounds per minute. They demanded precision, patience, and the pilot's ability to close to optimal range. The P-47's combined firepower, by contrast, threw approximately 6,400 rounds per minute into the airspace ahead of it. This wasn't about precision. This was about creating a wall of lead through which no aircraft could pass unscathed. The distinction between these weapon systems represented more than mere technical specifications. It embodied 2 fundamentally different philosophies of aerial combat, and for Luftwaffe pilots accustomed to the dynamics of fighting British opposition, the American approach proved psychologically devastating in ways that transcended simple mathematics. Understanding why requires examining not just the weapons themselves, but the entire tactical ecosystem they created, and the specific experiences of German pilots who encountered this difference firsthand. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots had developed sophisticated tactics for engaging RAF fighters, particularly the legendary Supermarine Spitfire. These tactics were built on hard-won experience over nearly 4 years of war. The Spitfire, in its various marks, typically carried a mixed armament package. Early versions mounted 8 303 machine guns. Later variants that German pilots faced over France and Germany featured 2 Hispano 20mm cannons, supplemented by 4 303 machine guns, or in some later marks, 4 20mm cannons. The cannons were the real threat. A single 20mm high-explosive round striking a fighter's engine or cockpit could end a sortie instantly. German pilots respected this lethality deeply. But that lethality came with limitations that experienced Luftwaffe pilots learned to exploit. The Hispano cannons, while powerful, suffered from relatively low ammunition capacity, typically 60 to 90 rounds per gun, and a modest rate of fire. This meant Spitfire pilots needed to choose their shots carefully. They had perhaps 3 to 4 seconds of combined cannon fire before exhausting their ammunition. The engagement geometry mattered enormously. Spitfire pilots were trained to close to within 300 yards before opening fire, ideally converging at around 250 yards, where their cannons' ballistics created an optimal concentration. German fighter tactics evolved to counter this. The defensive brake turn at the moment of attack could throw off the Spitfire pilot's deflection calculation. Vertical maneuvers, sudden climbs or dives, could rapidly change the range and angles. If a German pilot could force the Spitfire into a prolonged maneuvering engagement, the British pilot might exhaust his cannon ammunition without achieving a kill, reducing him to the far less threatening 303 machine guns. This was the calculus Stigler and thousands of other Luftwaffe pilots had internalized. Avoid the initial attack pass, force maneuvering, make the enemy waste his limited cannon shells, then exploit the window when his most dangerous weapons were empty. The Luftwaffe's training curriculum reflected this tactical reality. At fighter schools throughout 1943 and into 44, instructors emphasized aircraft energy management and defensive maneuvering. They taught their students to visually track the muzzle flashes of enemy cannons, to count the seconds of firing, to recognize the moment when the enemy had likely exhausted his most potent armament. This wasn't merely academic theory. Veteran pilots who cycled through as instructors brought first-hand accounts of surviving Spitfire attacks using exactly these methods. The training created a mental model. The engagement was fundamentally about surviving the initial cannon pass and then turning the tables during the maneuvering fight that followed. American pilots and their aircraft were known to the Luftwaffe, of course. Intelligence reports had described the P-47 Thunderbolt beginning in late 1942, and German pilots had encountered them in small numbers over France in 1943. But the intelligence picture was incomplete, filtered through the lens of existing assumptions about Allied fighter operations. The reports noted the P-47's size and weight. It was among the heaviest single-engine fighters in the war, and its reputation for ruggedness. They mentioned the American preference for machine guns over cannons. What these reports failed to convey was the visceral psychological reality of what 8 synchronized heavy machine guns actually meant in combat. The Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun was not merely a scaled-up rifle. It was an entirely different class of weapon. Each gun fired a round that weighed approximately 1 2/3 ounces, with a muzzle velocity of around 2,800 feet per second. The round itself was designed not as an anti-personnel weapon, but as an anti-material round, originally intended for use against light-armored vehicles, fortifications, and aircraft structures. When the United States Army Air Forces selected it as the standard armament for fighters, they made a calculated choice: volume of fire and effective range over per-shot destructive power. Each of the P-47's 8 guns carried between 300 and 400 rounds, depending on the specific variant and configuration. This gave the Thunderbolt pilot between 30 and 40 seconds of sustained firing time, more than 10 times the effective firing duration of a Spitfire's cannons. But the true difference emerged in how those weapons were employed. The 8 guns were mounted in the wings, 4 per side, converged at a point typically between 300 and 400 yards ahead of the aircraft. At this convergence point, the combined fire pattern created what American pilots called the beaten zone, an area roughly 6 feet in diameter, where all 8 streams of fire intersected. The rate of fire for each M2 was approximately 750 to 850 rounds per minute, depending on the specific gun and its condition. Multiply that by 8 guns, and the P-47 could put between 6,000 and 6,800 rounds into the air per minute of continuous firing. This wasn't measured in the careful 3-second bursts that Spitfire pilots learned to employ. This was sustained fire that could rake an enemy aircraft from nose to tail in a single pass, with the pilot holding the trigger for 5, 6, even 8 seconds without concern for ammunition exhaustion. The ballistic characteristics of the 50 caliber round created additional advantages that German pilots discovered the hard way. The heavier projectile retained its velocity and trajectory better over distance than the lighter cannon shells, making long-range gunnery more forgiving. An experienced P-47 pilot could open fire at 500 to 600 yards and walk his fire into the target, adjusting his aim based on the tracer feedback. The Spitfire pilot needed to be much closer before his cannon's ballistics became reliable. This range differential translated into critical seconds. seconds during which the American pilot was already firing while the German pilot was still trying to evade or position for his own shot. But perhaps the most significant tactical advantage, and the one that proved most psychologically corrosive to Luftwaffe morale, was what pilots called spray and pray capability, though this casual dismissal understates the genuine tactical value. A P-47 pilot engaging a maneuvering target didn't need perfect deflection calculation. He could afford to fire continuously through the engagement, adjusting his aim in real time, knowing his ammunition supply would last through the entire encounter. The heavy machine guns created what modern analysts might call a high probability of hit envelope, a zone where the sheer volume of projectiles in the air made evasion statistically improbable. German pilots who survived encounters with P-47s in early 1944 began reporting these characteristics in their debriefings, but the reports often read as near incredulous. Oberst Johannes Mackie Steinhoff, a highly decorated fighter pilot and wing commander, recorded his impressions after tangling with Thunderbolts over France in April 1944. His account describes the American fighters as impossibly aggressive, pressing attacks even when the tactical situation would have caused British pilots to disengage. The reason became clear when the Americans opened fire. They could afford to be aggressive because their ammunition supply permitted sustained pressure rather than the hit-and-run tactics that cannon-armed fighters required. The psychological dimension of this difference proved as important as the purely ballistic one. Combat pilots operate under extraordinary stress, making split-second decisions with incomplete information while experiencing significant physiological strain. The human nervous system evolved to respond to discrete threats, a predator lunging, an adversary striking. The Spitfire's cannons, with their distinctive sound and visible muzzle flashes, fit this threat pattern. A German pilot could hear and see the cannon firing, could count the bursts, could develop a sense for when the threat had passed. The engagement had rhythm, punctuation, identifiable moments of acute danger separated by relative safety. The P-47's guns shattered this psychological framework. The sound of 8 synchronized .50 calibers was continuous, a grinding roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The tracer pattern didn't appear as discrete bursts, but as what pilots described as streams or rivers of fire. There was no counting, no rhythm, no way to develop a sense for when the danger had passed. The threat was constant, for as long as the American pilot maintained his attack. German pilots reported that even when tracers weren't impacting their aircraft directly, the presence of that continuous fire stream induced a level of stress and disorientation unlike anything they'd experienced against British fighters. Lieutenant Heinz Knoke, whose memoir provides detailed accounts of aerial combat over Germany, documented a particularly revealing encounter in his diary entry for March 16, 1944. Knoke's Staffel engaged a formation of P-47's escorting bombers near Bremen. In the initial bounce, Knoke attempted his standard defensive break that had served him well against Spitfires. He described executing a hard left climbing turn, expecting to see the enemy overshoot or break off. Instead, the pursuing Thunderbolt simply held its position and kept firing. Knoke's aircraft absorbed strikes along the entire length of the fuselage before he could complete the maneuver and dive away. His control surfaces were shredded. His tail section looked as though someone had attacked it with an axe, and he barely reached base. What struck Knoke most in his debriefing wasn't the damage itself. He'd survived serious battle damage before, but the realization that the tactics he'd refined against British fighters were fundamentally inadequate. The American pilot hadn't needed to be precise. He'd simply needed to keep the guns pointed in approximately the right direction and hold the trigger. The volume of fire compensated for imperfect aim. This represented a paradigm shift in aerial gunnery that German training had not prepared pilots to counter. The technical reality behind this shift lay in divergent doctrinal philosophies between the European air forces and the Americans. British and German aviation doctrine had evolved from the same basic European military tradition, emphasizing quality over quantity, precision over volume. The Spitfire's cannons reflected this philosophy. A trained pilot making a well-executed attack with properly aimed cannon fire could destroy an enemy aircraft with a handful of shells. This was efficient, elegant, and consistent with the resource constraints both nations faced. Manufacturing 20mm cannon shells required precision machinery and skilled labor. Every shell needed to count. American industrial capacity permitted a different approach. The United States could manufacture 50 caliber ammunition in enormous quantities using highly automated production lines. A single round was less complex and less expensive to produce than a cannon shell. The M2 machine gun itself, while precision-made, was simpler and more reliable than contemporary cannon designs. This meant American fighters could carry staggering amounts of ammunition, 3,000 to 3,200 rounds for a P-47, and pilots could be trained in gunnery techniques that emphasized sustained fire and high volumes over precision shooting. The doctrine matched America's strengths: industrial output and a large pilot training pipeline that could produce competent shooters faster than it could produce elite marksmen. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. For Luftwaffe pilots, the implications went beyond simple tactical adjustment. The P-47's firepower advantage represented a fundamental material superiority that no amount of skill or courage could fully overcome. For Luftwaffe pilots, the implications went beyond simple tactical adjustment. The P-47's firepower advantage represented a fundamental material superiority that no amount of skill or courage could fully overcome. This realization began percolating through the ranks of Jagdgeschwader units defending the Reich in the spring of 1944. The psychological burden was distinct from facing superior numbers or even superior aircraft performance. Those challenges could be addressed through improved tactics, better training, or technological advances. But the firepower disparity stemmed from something far more intractable: the sheer productive capacity of American industry. Every P-47 that appeared over Germany carried enough ammunition to engage multiple targets across an entire mission. German fighters, by contrast, operated under increasingly severe logistical constraints that limited both ammunition and fuel availability. The contrast became starkest during the sustained American bomber offensive against German industrial targets. On missions deep into Germany, P-47 units would escort bomber formations for hours, engage defending fighters, strafe ground targets on the return flight, and still land with ammunition remaining. Luftwaffe pilots flying shorter-ranged aircraft with smaller ammunition loads had to carefully husband their resources. A Bf-19G6, the most common German fighter variant by mid-1944, carried 200 rounds for its engine-mounted 30mm cannon and 300 rounds for each of its two 13mm machine guns. Translated into firing time, this meant approximately 11 seconds of cannon fire and roughly 20 seconds of machine gun fire. One sustained attack pass could consume a quarter of the pilot's entire ammunition load. The tactical calculus this created was brutal. A German pilot engaging a bomber formation had perhaps 3 or 4 attack passes before exhausting his ammunition entirely. If American escort fighters intercepted him on his first or second pass, he faced an agonizing choice: break off the attack with ammunition remaining and survive, or press the attack against the bombers while enemy fighters closed in from behind. Many chose the latter, and the loss rates reflected it. Luftwaffe fighter units defending against daylight raids in March and April 1944 suffered catastrophic attrition. not primarily because American pilots were more skilled, but because the material equation had become mathematically unsolvable. Hauptmann Johannes Wiese, commanding officer of the Thre's JG-77, described this dynamic in a letter to his family dated April 8, 1944, which survived the war among his personal effects. Wiese had been flying combat missions since 1940, had accumulated victories against both British and Soviet opponents, and was regarded as one of the Luftwaffe's most capable fighter leaders. Yet his letter conveys an almost despairing tone regarding the situation over Germany. He writes of his pilots attacking bomber formations and being swarmed by escorts that seemed to have limitless ammunition. Several of his pilots had reported emptying their guns against bombers only to have escort fighters pursue them all the way back to base, maintaining fire throughout the chase. The escorts didn't need to make carefully aimed killing shots. They could simply keep shooting until accumulated damage forced the German aircraft down. This wore on pilot psychology in ways that went beyond the immediate fear of death. Luftwaffe pilots were trained to see themselves as warriors engaged in a test of skill and courage. The mythology of the fighter ace, the solitary knight of the air, ran deep in German military culture. Encounters with P-47's challenged this self-conception because the engagements often felt less like duels and more like industrial processes. The American fighters brought overwhelming firepower to bear in a way that felt impersonal, mechanical, divorced from the individual skill of the pilots involved. This wasn't entirely accurate. Many American P-47 pilots were exceptionally skilled, but the perception among German pilots was that American tactics relied on material advantage rather than superior airmanship. Evidence from interrogations of captured Luftwaffe pilots provides revealing insights into this psychological dimension. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted extensive interviews with German airmen after the war, and many accounts specifically mention the P-47's armament as particularly demoralizing. One fighter pilot, whose identity was recorded only as Subject 37 in the declassified documents, stated that engaging P-47's felt like flying into a thunderstorm of metal. He elaborated that against Spitfires he felt he had agency. He could outmaneuver, could wait for the British pilot to make a mistake. Against Thunderbolts, he felt the outcome was predetermined the moment they caught him in their sights. The ballistic characteristics of the .50 caliber rounds contributed significantly to this sense of helplessness. The projectiles had tremendous penetrating power against aircraft structures. German fighters used varying degrees of armor protection, but .50 caliber rounds could defeat most standard aircraft armor at typical combat ranges. The Bf-109's back armor, designed to protect against rifle caliber machine guns, offered little resistance to the American rounds. Pilots reported that strikes from .50 caliber guns often punched completely through their aircraft, exiting on the opposite side. This contrasted with cannon strikes, which typically exploded on impact, causing localized but severe damage. The difference might seem academic, but it had practical implications. A cannon hit to a wing might destroy control surfaces, but leave the wing structure partially intact. .50 caliber rounds riddled wings with holes that compromised structural integrity across the entire span. The effect on aircraft systems was similarly devastating. Engine components, cylinder heads, oil lines, coolant passages were particularly vulnerable. A single .50 caliber round, striking an engine block, could shatter it. Multiple strikes could reduce an engine to scrap metal in seconds. German pilots learned to fear the distinctive sound of heavy machine gun rounds striking their aircraft, a deep, resonant impact unlike the sharper crack of smaller caliber hits. That sound meant structural damage accumulating with each strike. Oberst Gunther Rahl, who survived the war as the third highest scoring ace in history with 275 victories, recorded in his post-war memoir that he feared P-47 attacks more than any other fighter type, specifically because of what those 8 guns did to an aircraft. He described seeing wingmen disintegrate under P-47 fire, not from a single catastrophic hit, but from accumulated damage that simply tore the aircraft apart in flight. This vulnerability forced changes in Luftwaffe tactics that further eroded the force's combat effectiveness. Fighter controllers began directing pilots to avoid engagement with escort fighters whenever possible, focusing exclusively on the bombers. The logic was cold. Losing pilots and aircraft in fighter versus fighter combat gained nothing if the bombers reached their targets anyway. Better to accept some fighter losses while ensuring that as many pilots as possible reached the bombers to disrupt the formations. This doctrine, formalized in orders from Luftwaffe High Command in late March 1944, essentially conceded air superiority to the escorts. German fighters would attempt to penetrate the escort screen through speed and surprise, hit the bombers, and escape before the escorts could respond. In practice, this proved nearly impossible to execute. The P-47s flew top cover above the bomber formations, positioned perfectly to dive on any German fighters attempting to attack from below or level with the bombers. The dive gave the Thunderbolts additional speed, and their heavy weight, over 7 tons at combat loading, meant they could maintain that speed through the dive better than the lighter German fighters. Once a P-47 locked onto a target in a dive, the pursuing German pilot had few options. The Thunderbolt could follow him down, maintaining fire throughout. Pulling up sharply could work if executed before the American pilot got into effective range, but that meant breaking off the attack run against the bombers entirely. The tactical trap was complete. Press the attack and die to the escorts, or break off and allow the bombers through. Major Gunther Specht, who commanded the G-11 defending central Germany, kept detailed tactical journals throughout 1944. His entries from March through May document his unit's struggle to develop viable attack methods against escorted bomber formations. Specht's intelligence officers had compiled detailed reports on P-47 performance characteristics, weapons, and tactics. The unit experimented with various approaches: high-speed slashing attacks from above, coordinated; multi-directional attacks designed to split the escort; even head-on attacks against the bombers that minimized exposure to escort fire. None proved consistently successful. The entry for May 2nd notes laconically that his Gruppe had lost 12 pilots in 3 days of operations, with another 7 aircraft damaged beyond immediate repair. The cause of death listed in most cases: intercepted by escort fighters during attack approach. The Americans, for their part, understood exactly what they were doing. United States Army Air Force's fighter doctrine, as outlined in training manuals and tactical directives from late 1943 onward, explicitly emphasized aggressive prosecution of enemy fighters. Unlike Royal Air Force escort doctrine, which often kept fighters close to the bombers in a defensive posture, American tactics encouraged P-47 units to seek out and engage German fighters before they could reach the bombers. The massive ammunition load made this practical. P-47 pilots could afford to engage in extended dogfights, chase fleeing opponents, and still have rounds remaining for additional targets. Fighter group commanders emphasized this advantage in their briefings. Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, the highest-scoring P-47 unit in the European theater, was particularly articulate about his unit's tactical philosophy. In post-war interviews, Zemke described the P-47's guns as the aircraft's primary advantage. The Thunderbolt wasn't the fastest fighter, wasn't the most maneuverable, but it could bring crushing firepower to bear in any engagement. Zemke's orders to his pilots were explicit: When you find German fighters, keep shooting until they go down. Don't fire a quick burst and break off. Stay on target. The guns and ammunition exist to be used. This was fundamentally different from RAF tactical guidance, which emphasized ammunition conservation. The results spoke clearly. By May 1944, P-47 units operating over Germany were achieving kill ratios that exceeded 5-1 against Luftwaffe day fighters. Some missions saw ratios approaching 8 or 10-1. These figures weren't primarily attributable to pilot skill disparities. Many Luftwaffe pilots were combat veterans with far more experience than their American opponents. The difference came down to the tactical options available to each side. American pilots could make mistakes, miss shots, and still maintain offensive pressure because their ammunition lasted throughout the engagement. German pilots needed near-perfect execution on their first attack pass because they might not get a second opportunity. The psychological toll on the Luftwaffe became evident in pilot reports and unit diaries as the spring progressed. Fighter units that had maintained high morale through years of combat began showing signs of severe strain. Pilots requested transfers to night fighter units or to the Eastern Front, anywhere, except day fighter defense against the American heavies. The official Luftwaffe term for this was Reichsverteidigungsmüdigkeit, Reich defense fatigue, a bureaucratic label for what was essentially a collapse in fighting spirit among pilots who felt they were being sent to die in an unwinnable situation. Medical officers attached to fighter units documented increasing cases of combat stress reactions. Pilots developed nervous conditions, insomnia, and what would later be recognized as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. One particularly telling report from a Luftwaffe flight surgeon in April 1944 noted that pilots were more psychologically affected by missions against American daylight raids than by comparable sortie counts against Soviet forces. The surgeon attributed this to the psychological burden of facing materially superior opposition where individual skill offers little protection. The P-47's guns featured prominently in these psychological profiles. Pilots described the sound of massed 50 caliber fire as particularly stress-inducing, comparing it to industrial machinery or describing it as inhuman. This psychological dimension intersected with brutal physical reality. The 50 caliber rounds produced horrific wounds when they struck human tissue. Luftwaffe pilots who survived being hit described injuries unlike those from smaller caliber rounds. The massive projectiles could sever limbs, caused extensive wound cavitation, and often proved fatal even when striking extremities due to shock and blood loss. Aircraft cockpits offered minimal protection. The plexiglass canopies that gave pilots visibility also made them vulnerable. P-47 pilots learned to aim for the cockpit area when engaging from behind, knowing that their guns could punch through the canopy and armor backing. German pilots knew this too, adding another layer of stress to every engagement. The technological response from German industry came too late and in insufficient quantities to alter the situation. Designers experimented with heavier armor protection, but adding armor meant reducing performance, which made aircraft more vulnerable to being caught in the first place. Some units received FW-190s equipped with additional cockpit armor, but pilots reported that the added weight negatively affected climb rate and maneuverability, critical factors when trying to evade escort fighters. The fundamental equation couldn't be solved through incremental improvements. The Americans had too many fighters carrying too much ammunition, flown by an expanding pilot pool that could absorb losses and continue operations. By June 1944, with the invasion of Normandy, the situation deteriorated further. P-47 units began operating from forward bases in France, extending their range and loiter time over Germany. The 9th Air Force's P-47 groups, initially designated for ground attack missions, found themselves engaging Luftwaffe fighters, with devastating effectiveness. These pilots, trained for air-to-ground work, proved that even moderately skilled shooters could be lethal in a P-47 because the weapon's platform compensated for imperfect aim. Luftwaffe pilots who had survived months of combat against 8th Air Force escorts now faced fresh American units approaching from a different direction, all carrying the same crushing armament advantage. The contrast with earlier periods of the air war became inescapable. In 1940 and 41, Luftwaffe pilots had entered combat with equipment parity or advantage against their opponents. By mid-1944, they faced opponents whose basic weapons load exceeded their own by a factor of 5 or 6. This wasn't a situation that better tactics or improved training could meaningfully address. The pilots knew it, the commanders knew it, and the knowledge infected everything. Mission briefings that once focused on attack tactics and formation discipline now emphasized survival techniques and emergency procedures. The psychological shift from offense to damage control was complete. Lieutenant Hans Joachim Marseille, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful pilots with 158 confirmed victories before his death in 1942, had once written that the fighter pilot's greatest weapon is his confidence. That confidence, built on technical competence and belief in equipment, sustained pilots through the stress of combat. By the summer of 1944, that confidence had evaporated among pilots facing American escorts. They flew because orders demanded it, because their homeland required defense, because military discipline compelled it. But the belief that skill and courage could overcome material disadvantage had died somewhere over the skies of Germany, killed by the sustained roar of 8 synchronized 50-caliber machine guns. The final months of the air war over Europe saw this dynamic play out to its inevitable conclusion. As Allied armies advanced into Germany itself, P-47 units operated from bases increasingly close to their targets. German fighter production actually increased in late 1944, but fuel shortages and the loss of experienced pilots meant that newly manufactured aircraft often sat unused or flew with inadequately trained pilots. When these novice pilots encountered American fighters, the results were predictable and tragic. Combat reports from American fighter groups in November and December of 1944 describe engagements where German fighters seemed to disintegrate under fire, their pilots apparently frozen or panicked by the volume of incoming fire. Some German pilots did adapt successfully. The highest-scoring aces, men like Major Gerhard Barkhorn and Oberst Erich Hartmann, survived by developing tactics that minimized exposure to sustained fire. They emphasized single high-speed attack passes. Avoiding prolonged engagements entirely, they picked isolated targets, avoided combat when outnumbered, and ruthlessly exploited any momentary advantage before breaking off. But these men represented a tiny fraction of the force. The average Luftwaffe pilot lacked the hundreds of combat hours these experts had accumulated, and lacked the judgment to know when to engage and when to flee. For them, encountering P-47's over Germany in late 1944 meant facing an opponent that could maintain offensive pressure indefinitely while they rationed every burst from their guns. The aftermath of the war brought opportunities for more reflective analysis. Adolf Galland, who commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter forces for much of the war, wrote extensively about German air operations in his post-war memoir. Galland devoted considerable attention to the American escort fighters and their impact on the air campaign. He noted that while the P-51 Mustang received more attention for its long range, the P-47 was the aircraft Luftwaffe pilots feared most in direct combat. The reason, Galland wrote, was simple. The 8 guns made every American pilot dangerous, regardless of his training level. An expert British pilot in a Spitfire was deadly. A novice British pilot was merely dangerous. But even a mediocre American pilot in a Thunderbolt could kill you if he got on your tail, because he could keep shooting until something vital broke. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.